You would think this is one of those silly old warnings people repeat without thinking. A harmless superstition, the kind of thing a grandmother says and everyone laughs but still obeys. And yet in Ireland, one small act has carried a strange weight for generations. Put a pair of shoes on a table, and suddenly the mood changes. Someone will pull them down immediately. Someone else may glare at you like you have invited something dark into the house. And then comes the warning, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, but always certain: never put shoes on an Irish table. At first, it sounds almost absurd. Why would something so ordinary matter so much? Why should a pair of shoes resting for a moment on a wooden table feel wrong enough to unsettle an entire room? Is it really about bad luck? Is it just an old village superstition that somehow survived into modern life? Or is there something deeper hidden inside the warning? A logic wrapped so tightly in folklore that many people obey it without ever knowing where it came from? Because this is what makes Irish tradition so fascinating. In Ireland, the line between practical wisdom and inherited magic is often very thin. A rule may sound mystical on the surface, yet underneath it you often find memory, hardship, religion, death, dignity, and common sense all tied together. What looks like superstition may actually be culture preserving a lesson. What sounds like magic may really be history speaking in the language of the home. And the rule about shoes on the table may be one of the clearest examples of that. To understand why it matters, you have to understand the Irish home, and especially the Irish table. In many homes, especially in older Ireland, the table was never just furniture. It was not simply a flat surface where objects happened to land. The table was one of the central spaces of life itself. It was where bread was cut, tea was poured, prayers were said, news was shared, letters were read, problems were discussed, and grief was quietly carried. It was where a family gathered at the beginning of the day and at the end of it. It was a place of food, of talk, of silence, and of ritual. When you understand that, the insult begins to make more sense. Shoes belong to the road. They belong to dirt, mud, fields, rain, animal waste, the outside world. The table belongs to food, hands, cups, plates, and family. Shoes are what touch the ground. The table is where life is sustained. Even without a single superstition attached to it, many people would already feel that putting shoes on a table breaks a kind of invisible boundary. It confuses what should remain separate. It drags the outside onto the inside. It places what is lowest onto what should be kept clean and respected. And in rural Ireland, this mattered even more than it might today. Think about what shoes once passed through. Not polished city pavement, not clean shopping centers, but wet lanes, farmyards, muddy tracks, animal paths, manure-covered ground, graveyard soil, and the rough, dirty conditions of a difficult life. Shoes were not just dusty. They could carry the entire mess of daily survival. So from a purely practical point of view, the rule makes perfect sense. Keep shoes off the table because the table is where food goes. Keep the dirt of the road away from the place where your family eats. Keep contamination away from the center of the house. That alone would have been enough to create a strong household custom. But in Ireland, practical rules often did not remain merely practical. They became moral. They became emotional. They became symbolic. And over time, they became something very close to sacred. That is where the magic enters. Many Irish household warnings were passed down not in the language of hygiene or social logic, but in the language of luck, blessing, and danger. You did not always explain a rule by saying, "This is unsanitary," or "This is disrespectful." You said, "Don't do that, it brings bad luck." That kind of warning had force. It stayed in the mind. It reached children more effectively than a long explanation. It turned a practical habit into something memorable and binding. It gave ordinary behavior a spiritual consequence. And Ireland has always had a deep memory for that kind of thinking. Not because Irish people were foolish, but because they understood that a home is held together not only by walls and roofs, but by customs, respect, and the unseen meanings attached to daily life. The ordinary was never entirely ordinary. A threshold was not just a strip of stone. A fire was not just heat. A table was not just wood. Actions carried a tone. Objects had a place. To disturb that order was sometimes felt as more than bad manners. It felt like you were disturbing the peace of the house itself. That is why so many old Irish taboos survive, even when people no longer fully believe in them. The belief may weaken, but the discomfort remains. Someone may laugh and say they are not superstitious at all, and yet they will still never place shoes on a table. Why? Because culture can outlive explanation. A rule repeated for generations becomes part of instinct. It settles into the body before it stays in the mind. But there is another, darker layer to this particular custom. And this is where the warning becomes more than a matter of dirt or manners. For some people, the strongest association behind shoes on a table is not filth. It is death. Across parts of Ireland and Britain, one explanation tied to this taboo points to old funeral practices and the handling of the dead. In some traditions, when a person died, their belongings, including their shoes, could take on a strong emotional and symbolic charge. In poorer times, a pair of shoes might be one of the last physical traces of the person's working life. Shoes were close to the body. They had traveled with the person through life. They had weight, shape, and memory. And in some accounts, shoes connected with the dead or with funeral preparation became part of the household atmosphere of mourning. There are also traditions outside Ireland, especially in industrial communities, where dead miners' boots might be placed on a table as a sign of death. Whether that exact version was universal in Ireland or not, the broader emotional logic is easy to understand. Shoes elevated onto a table could evoke mourning, loss, and the presence of death in the home. A table that should hold food and fellowship was suddenly made to carry something associated with the end of life. That reversal would have felt chilling. Over time, even if the original event faded from memory, the act itself remained marked. Shoes on the table became an omen, a gesture that felt wrong because somewhere behind it stood the shadow of death. This is how customs deepen. A practical rule gets reinforced by an emotional memory. An emotional memory gets protected by superstition. And superstition gets passed along as absolute law. So when an older Irish parent or grandparent says that putting shoes on the table brings bad luck, they may be carrying several worlds at once without even realizing it. One part of the rule says, keep dirt away from where we eat. Another part says, respect the house. Another says, do not invite the feel of death into the heart of the home. Another says, our people before us did not do this, so neither do we. And that layered logic is what makes the custom so powerful. It also reveals something important about Irish culture more broadly. Irish tradition often preserves truth through image rather than argument. Instead of explaining every reason in cold detail, it wraps wisdom in a story, a fear, a warning, or a phrase. A modern mind may dismiss that as irrational, but in reality, it is often a brilliant way of storing cultural knowledge. If you tell a child, keep your dirty shoes away from the table because that is where we eat, the child may or may not care. But if you say, never put shoes on the table, it brings bad luck, the lesson sticks. The action becomes memorable. The rule survives. That does not mean every superstition is wise, but it does mean many of them were functional. They shaped behavior. They protected order. They kept the home clean, respectful, and predictable. They turned values into habits. And in a place like Ireland, where family memory has long carried more weight than written instruction, habits mattered. The home was one of the main places where culture lived, not in official speeches, not in academic books, but in what you did and did not do at the hearth, at the door, at the bedside, and around the table. This is why the table itself deserves more attention. In many traditional Irish homes, especially those shaped by Catholic life and rural hardship, the table could hold almost the status of an altar of daily survival. That may sound dramatic, but think about it. Food was not taken for granted. Bread mattered. Hospitality mattered. A place at the table meant inclusion. A full table meant blessing. A quiet table after bad news could feel heavy as stone. Families gathered there for ordinary evenings, but also for births, deaths, prayers, and decisions. To treat that space carelessly was to break a deeper code of respect. So the rule against shoes on the table is not just about what shoes are. It is about what the table is. And that is a distinction modern people often miss. We tend to flatten all surfaces into the same thing. A table becomes just another place to set an item. But older cultures did not always think that way. Spaces had character. Rooms had meaning. Objects had proper places. The order of the house reflected the order of life. To cross those boundaries without thought was to become careless not only with things, but with meaning itself. That is why similar taboos exist in many households, even beyond Ireland. Don't open an umbrella indoors. Don't walk under a ladder. Don't place a hat on a bed. Don't whistle at night. To the modern ear, these can sound random. But many started with some practical reason, some symbolic fear, or some moral instinct. The Irish genius was in preserving such things with emotional force. Not everything had to be proven in order to be obeyed. Sometimes the community simply knew that a rule held something worth keeping. And perhaps that is why this one still survives so easily. Even people who know nothing of the old beliefs can feel the logic immediately. Shoes are dirty. Tables are for food. That part is obvious. But even beyond cleanliness, there remains something almost universally human in the discomfort. A shoe is what carries the pressure of the road. It is worn on the lowest part of the body. It absorbs the outside world. To lift it above the level of a meal, a mug, a loaf, or a prayer book feels like an inversion of order. It feels disrespectful, even to people who could not explain why. That emotional response is not weakness. It is memory. In a strange way, customs like this allow the past to keep speaking. They preserve the values of people who may never be named in history books. The poor mother who scrubbed the table before serving bread. The father who came in from the fields with muck on his boots. The grandmother who connected disorder with misfortune because she had seen too much hardship to take peace for granted. These people may not have written philosophy, but they passed down a way of seeing. And sometimes that way of seeing is hidden inside one sharp little command: get those shoes off the table. So, is it superstition? Yes, in part. There is clearly an old fear of bad luck attached to the act. For many, that fear was real. But is it only superstition? Not all. It is also hygiene. It is symbolism. It is a way of defending the dignity of the household. It is a refusal to let the roughness of the outside world invade the place where family is fed. It is a memory of death kept at a distance. It is culture teaching order through a gesture. That is the real logic inside the magic. And maybe that is the lesson hidden in so many old Irish customs. They are not merely relics from a gullible past. They are compressed forms of experience. They carry the emotional intelligence of people who live close to hunger, weather, religion, loss, and one another. They found ways to protect what mattered. Sometimes they used stories. Sometimes they used warnings. Sometimes they called it luck. But underneath, they were often guarding something deeply practical and deeply human. A clean table, a respectful home, a boundary between dirt and food, a boundary between life and death, a habit strong enough to survive explanation. So the next time you hear someone say, "Never put shoes on an Irish table," do not dismiss it too quickly. You're not just hearing a superstition. You are hearing centuries of domestic wisdom condensed into one line. You're hearing the voice of a culture that understood that small actions shape the feeling of a home. You are hearing the past protect the present in a language of warning. And maybe that is why the rule still has power. Not because everyone literally believes disaster will follow, but because somewhere deep down, many people still feel that some things should remain in their proper place. Some boundaries should not be crossed. Some spaces deserve respect. The road is the road. The table is the table. And in Ireland, that difference was never small. If you grew up hearing this warning, or if your family had similar customs that sounded like superstition but actually carried hidden logic, share them in the comments. And if you enjoy exploring the hidden meanings inside Irish traditions, folklore, and family rules, subscribe and join me for the next one.